I'd like to introduce Dr. Matt Harris in our next conversation. He's done a lot of Mormon history work, and he's not very well known, but I think he will be, especially after he finishes his upcoming books. We'll talk about some of these books that he's published, as well as his future books. We're also going to talk about the history of the ban. With the 40th anniversary of the removal of the ban coming up here in just a few weeks, this will be a very timely interview. Dr. Matt Harris has some really interesting insights and is going to reveal some really cool historical information. It's one of my favorite interviews yet. Now, let's ask a little bit about how he's going to talk about Brazil. What did the church do with missionaries there? Well, welcome to Gospel Tangents podcast. I'm really excited to meet with Dr. Matt Harris here at Colorado State University, Pueblo. This is my farthest interview yet. I've talked to somebody from Australia and somebody from Italy, but this is my farthest away yet. So we're here in Pueblo, Colorado. So, Matt, could you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, Matt Harris is my name. I've been teaching here since 2005. Started my professional career at Dixie State University, Southern Utah. And I went to BYU for a bachelor's and a master's degree in history, and another master's degree and PhD at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York.
Go Orange.
Yeah.
Well, cool. And so, I have to say, I think you, and I'm going to try to flatter you a little bit here, but I really believe this. I think you are one of the gems in the Mormon community that people don't know yet. And I feel like I've discovered you, and I'm like, because I think you're doing some awesome work in Mormon history.
Thanks.
And so, could you talk a little bit about some of the projects you're working on?
Yeah, so in 2015, I published a book with Newell Bringhurst called The Mormon Church in Blacks, A Documentary History. And that was my first foray into Mormon studies. I started my career as an early American scholar, so did a book on the Founding Fathers and religion in American history, and then also a book with a BYU professor named Jay Buckley on Thomas Jefferson and Zebulon Pike and the exploration of the American West. And then I caught the Mormon history bug, and so did the Black and Mormon book in 2015. And I've been working on several projects since then. I have 2 books on Ezra Taft Benson that will be published next year. And I have a book on a collection of essays that I've edited with Newell Bringhurst on the Gospel Topics essays, which is really fascinating. And then finally, my big project that I'm really excited about is a second book on the LDS Church in Blacks since World War II. And that'll be out. I have 3 chapters written, and that'll be out. Who knows when it'll be out?
Okay.
2019, maybe.
Well, that's interesting, because that's actually the topic that I really want to talk to you about today. But 2 books on Ezra Taft Benson, is this like going to be a Quinn,
No.
It doesn't fit in 1 book, so you got to do 2?
Well, the first book is it's a documentary history of Elder Benson, and it's a lengthy introduction, probably 100-page introduction, which is strange for an introduction.
Wow, that is long.
Contextual essay. And the book is a collection of documents that have never been published on Benson's life. So his FBI files, part of those are published. Letters to the John Birch Society president. He was very good friends with Robert Welch. Bob Welch is his name. Also oral histories that was done with the family. And so a lot of stuff from the Eisenhower collection library, which is where the Benson family deposited the agricultural papers with Ezra Taft Benson in the early 2000s. So a lot of documents that have never been published before. That's the first book. The second book is I've edited a collection of essays on Elder Benson, and it's about his rise in politics in the Eisenhower administration, also as a significant conservative leader after World War II. Most people don't realize that he was a presidential candidate and that he was very, very close with Barry Goldwater and some other leading conservative intellectuals, or leaders, I should say, politicians after World War II. And then, of course, Benson as a churchman. And as we can, I'm sure, talk about in a minute, Benson didn't make a whole lot of distinction between his politics and his religion. So it's a collection of essays from folks at BYU in Provo, BYU in Idaho. I did an essay let's see, who else? Goodness. Matthew Bowman did an essay, who's a very good scholar. Neil Bringhurst, Gary Bergera. So a wide range of people contribute to this volume. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, it sounds cool.
It'll be published next year. So.
Well, and I like, what I'd like to talk to you about today, although I think we were going to have to schedule more than one interview. You've got a lot of interesting stuff. And I think we'll cover a little bit of Benson, because that relates to kind of what I'd really like to talk to you about is kind of the Black Mormon history from World War II to present. And so obviously that overlaps with President Benson, or Elder Benson, Apostle Benson back then quite a bit. So I'm sure we'll get into a little bit about that today. So, and as far as I know, to me, when I think of World War II, 41 to 45, I know when we think about Black history, 1949 was a big important statement. Is that kind of where your book is going to start?
A little bit before that. After World War II, or even during World War II, President McKay, I guess he's first president then. But anyway, the first presidency starts to think about expanding the church globally. And after the war, it really kicks into high gear. And they recognize, of course, that if you're going to expand the church globally, it presents some significant challenges if African nations, if the priesthood ban doesn't allow African folks to control their own destiny, govern their own churches. And so the church is already in South Africa by this point, and this is really the first time where President McKay, who's now the church president, experiences the difficulty of bringing the gospel to a nation where there's a strong biracial component. And it becomes very challenging when the mission president and the missionaries are trying to determine who has, as they put it in those days, Negroid blood. So anyway, they write letters to President McKay, and it forces him and his counselors and the governing leadership of the church to figure out, what do we do about this problem, as the missionaries and the mission president are trying to determine who ought to hold the priesthood and who shouldn't. So that's the first thing. And then Brazil is also a challenge after the war. They'd been in Brazil for quite some time after World War II. And Brazil has this heavy biracial component, even more so than in South Africa. So between those two countries, it forces church leaders into some very interesting predicaments. And President McKay gives it a lot of thought and decides to keep the ban in the 1950s. But there were some intense discussions even then about lifting the ban. Oh, wow, that early. Yeah, that early. Because I know in Greg Prince's book, he talks a little bit about a situation in South Africa with the mission president. Are you familiar with that? Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how that relates to the ban? Yeah, so President Evan P. Wright is his name. He writes President McKay, and he said, we've got this problem. What do we do? And President McKay will travel to South Africa to visit with the mission. And when he's in South Africa meeting with President Wright and the missionaries, he'll see things up close and personal, as it were, and that the challenges of bringing the gospel to these folks who may have black blood in them, as they say. So he decides that to reverse the policy that had been in place for years. And it really catches some of the leaders in Salt Lake off guard, because President McKay does it unilaterally. And the policy is that people in South Africa they no longer have to trace their genealogy out of Africa in order to prove that they have Caucasian bloodlines. And what that means is that before that happened, if you were a prospective convert to the church, and you got baptized, which is okay, it didn't matter if you were African with Negro ancestry. Not American, African. Yeah, it would be African American, would it? So African blood, we'll say. If you fell under the parameters of the priesthood restriction, you could still get baptized. You just couldn't get ordained into the Melchizedek priesthood, Aaronic or Melchizedek. So what President McKay does is that he says you no longer have to trace your genealogy out of Africa, because it created a tremendous burden on the South African mission. They had diverted a number of their missionaries from proselytizing to doing genealogy work, trying to determine who had Negroid blood. And that was just a tremendous burden on the missionary, the South African mission. And so when President McKay reversed that policy, he sends a letter back to the 12. This is what I've done. And usually this is a deliberative body, so President McKay was wont to do things like this. Occasionally he would make these unilateral policy changes. But nonetheless, he makes this change, and what it means is that if there is no compelling evidence that you have black blood, Negroid blood, then we'll conform you or ordain you to the priesthood. So, for example, if it's clear that your grandfather is from Africa and you have black blood, then you can't be ordained. The restriction applies to you. But if you don't know, then we're going to err on the side of we don't think that the ban applies to you, and we'll give you the priesthood. So it's a fundamental change in policy that President McKay implements, and President Wright, of course, is happy with it because it allows his missionaries to get back on the streets again and not have to spend most of their time trying to figure out genealogy lines and where these folks come from.
Now, how long was that policy in place before President McKay got rid of it?
Good question. Probably since the 30s, early 40s, maybe.
So 10, 20 years, something
Probably
like that.
so,
In that
yeah,
range.
because the church had been very reluctant to move into these kinds of nations, because of the priesthood ban. Even as early as 1938, J. Reuben Clark, who's in the first presidency, very powerful, influential counselor, President Clark will say that, I know we're baptizing people in Brazil that have Negroid blood. I know we're doing it. And of course he didn't like it, but he recognized how difficult it was to determine ancestry. And so Brazil was something a little bit different. There was no centralized policy from Salt Lake City in terms of how to determine bloodlines. And in the absence of a central policy, it created, as you can imagine, a disparity across missions. One mission president would do it one way and another mission president would do something different. And in Brazil, they were kind of trendsetters, if you will, that they did what are called lineage lessons. And so the mission president instructed the missionaries, and the mission president, I should say, got approval from Salt Lake to do this lineage lesson. But it really was just mostly practiced in Brazil rather than other places with, African populations. But anyway, these lineage lessons stipulated that if missionaries were out proselytizing and they came across somebody who had African ancestry, it was apparent that they would fall under the parameters of the restriction, that they were supposed to come to the door, knock on the door, recognize that they were under the ban, and then they would just say, can you tell us, we're in the neighborhood, we're trying to find this general store or this other church, can you tell us where it is? And if they weren't sure, if this couple had African ancestry, then they would come in and they would ask them questions about their genealogy, trying to determine just through discussion if they had African roots. And sometimes they would even ask to look at a photo album. And they were discreet about it. They weren't going to tell people this is what we're looking for. But it shows you how difficult the burden was of determining this bloodline. And J. Reuben Clark recognized this as early as 1938 and expressed skepticism that the church could confer the priesthood on Brazilians without violating this policy. And at one point, a little later on in the 1940s and 50s, J. Reuben Clark, more than any other leader, will work with a Mormon scientist named Alban Matson. And he's a medical researcher, he's a medical doctor, he's got an MD. And Dr. Matson will do his best to determine bloodlines scientifically. He's going to these conferences that deal with blood types and all of this stuff, and he would write President Clark a note and say, this is what I learned. I think we're getting close to determine bloodlines scientifically. And clearly that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen that way. But J. Reuben Clark is really, really interested in determining scientifically how to tell if somebody has African blood or not. So he's working with Dr. Matson. And this will go on well into the 1950s.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Matt Harris. In our next conversation, we'll talk about the similarities and differences between LDS racial beliefs and Protestants, especially in the 1960s.
Truthfully, I mean this respectfully, but you'll read some of the leaders, Elder McConkie and his father-in-law, Joseph Fielding Smith. I mean, it reads just like a Southern Protestant clergyman when they're talking about, segregation and civil rights and so forth and the curse of Cain. I mean, really, in my view, there's no distinction with some of these sermons if you juxtapose them.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure that you like our page on facebook.com/gospeltangents. You can subscribe at youtube.com/gospeltangents. We're also on Twitter at Gospel Tangents, as well as make sure that you subscribe on iTunes so you don't miss any of our episodes. Thanks again for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some more of our videos. Thanks again.